There is a crisis in the Kremlin. Insiders who know more than most have just admitted the unthinkable. Something gigantic has broken in Russia and it can't be fixed. Those insiders know what Putin doesn't know. Russia's leader is trapped in a war that he can't win. Every single day that the Ukraine war goes on is a day when Putin plunges his country deeper into a black hole of despair. Putin can't afford to quit, but Russia can't afford to fight. There's no way out from here as Putin has created a version of Russia that can't survive much longer. How did Russia get here? We'll be answering that question after we cover what the insiders have to say about the state of their country. And those insiders revealed the catastrophe that stands before Putin. The Russian budget can no longer afford the war that Putin started. Internal division is raging inside the Kremlin, as economists with both the Russian Ministry of Finance and the Russian Central Bank warn that the continuation of the Ukraine invasion will result in the state budget deficit ballooning beyond repair. That deficit already looks bad for Russia. During the first 4 months of 2026, the Russian Ministry of Finance reported that the deficit had risen to 5.8 trillion rubles, which amounts to around $80.6 billion. That's bad enough, but it gets worse when you find out that the same ministry had projected a deficit of 3.7 trillion rubles for the entire year. Right now, Russia's state budget deficit accounts for 2.5% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, and there seems to be no way for Russia to recover unless Putin ends his war. That's the problem. Putin isn't going to stop, and that's why he's trapped. Economy officials are trying to push the defense ministry to make the cuts to ease the burden being placed on Russia's finances by Putin's invasion. United 24 media reports that this push is being resisted to the point where Russia has been forced to downgrade its economic growth forecast for 2026 to just 0.4%. Russia is balancing on a knife edge and is going to be sliced soon. Recession looms as stagnation arrives. And it's not just officials in the Kremlin who are screaming at Putin to open his eyes and look at the situation that he has created within his own country. Business leaders are also signaling that the only way for Russia to even get close to coming back on track is if Putin ends the war. These calls rarely come directly. However, you can see the sentiment among Russia's business leaders if you look closely enough. The New Voice of Ukraine reports on comments made by a senior corporate executive who says that one look at the stock market tells you all that you need to know about what Russia's business leaders think about the invasion. The rallies and enthusiasm on the Russian stock market after every piece of positive news about US-brokered peace talks on Ukraine show what the real answer should be, the executive says. The message is clear. Russia's economic minds inside the Kremlin want the war to end, or at least for Putin to make defense spending cuts to ease the burden. Russia's biggest brains are issuing a similar call through their actions as they battle tax increases, faltering investment, double-digit interest rates that currently stand at 14.5%, and a complete dearth of new ideas coming out of the Kremlin. And what is Putin's answer to all of this? He wants to spend even more on his war. Every single call being made by those who can see the disaster that lies ahead for Russia is being resisted by Russia's defense ministry. Don't worry about the people or the businesses, military officials say as they follow Putin's orders. Just pump more money into a fight that's going nowhere. United 24 media reports that Russia's defense ministry is demanding more funding as it battles to cover a shortfall that is set to reach around 3 trillion rubles, or around $41.7 billion in 2026. The same ministry also points to the economy that Putin has created as the reason why it should be given more money. Military contracts rule all in Putin's Russia right now. If the defense ministry spends less, fewer contracts are issued, and the few companies that are thriving in Russia right now will start to collapse, just like everything else. This is the trap that Putin has created for himself. If he withdraws from the war, he may stand a chance of saving Russia's economy, but the humiliation caused by his failure will weaken his power base to the point where he'll be more vulnerable than he's ever been before. But if he keeps going with the war and funnels more money into military contracts, he cripples Russia for the sake of a fight that has seen Ukraine seize the initiative as we come closer to the end of the first half of 2026. Russian gains are minimal, and the country is actively losing ground in some areas. In a June 1st report, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, highlights Putin's main problem. ISW observed evidence to assess the Russian forces gained control of or infiltrated 40.64 square kilometers between December 2025 and May 2026. Russian forces, however, lost 281.1 square kilometers in the same period, when only considering territory that Russian forces control, the think tank says. And this stagnation on the battlefield is also bringing death to Russian soldiers in record numbers. Ukraine says that Russia lost more than 35,000 soldiers per month in both March and April. With daily casualty figures hovering around the 1,400 mark toward the end of May, we're likely to see similar or larger figures for that month. Russia has traded all of these dead soldiers for minimal gains in Ukraine's east and outright losses in the south. None of this is sustainable on the manpower front. But Putin never really worries about the meat he feeds into the grinder. What he should be worrying about is what he has done to Russia to sustain his war. Everyone sees that Putin is caught in a trap. Still, Russia's leader pushes, and the state of Russia right now tells you everything that you need to know about what lies in the country's future. We've covered some of it already: the rising budget deficit, the stagnating economy, officials and business owners who are practically begging Putin to stop his war so that Russia has a chance of surviving. But right now, nothing is going to plan for Russia. When officials drafted the country's budget for 2026, they knew that a funding gap of between $1.2 trillion and $1.5 trillion, or up to $20.6 billion, would develop, largely as a result of military spending. That gap has already been blown open into a yawning chasm, and it's only going to get larger as Putin sacrifices more soldiers and equipment to the war. Putin might think that he can sustain this with more growth in Russia's defense sector, but he can't. The spokesman reports that not even that sector is booming like it once was. During the first few years of the invasion, Russia's state defense industry grew by about 30%, which is why Russia appeared to be economically healthy up to the end of 2024. Now, sectors that are tied to Russia's military are only anticipated to record growth in the 4% to 5% range. That means they've basically hit their peak and it's all downhill from here. And that 0.4% GDP expansion we mentioned earlier, that was meant to be 1.3% before Russia's economy ministry was forced to downgrade. Russia's national wealth fund is now 60% below the level that it was before Putin launched his invasion. The country's budget deficit is creeping ever closer to the 3.8% of GDP that it reached during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a disaster at the time but may soon become Russia's new normal. Still, government spending rises. The first 4 months of 2026 saw the Kremlin spend 16% more than it spent during the same period in 2025, even as Russia's economic bubble bursts. Spending on state procurement rose by 41%, the Statesman reports. This is Putin's response: let the Russian people struggle while he shoots for a legacy of one of Russia's great conquerors that is already so far out of his reach that he'll never attain it. And so we come back to the question that we posed at the beginning of the video: how did Russia get here? Putin's military spending is just part of a much larger tale of woe that has engulfed Russia's entire economy. The full story involves Ukraine, of course. It also involves Russian oil, the absolute collapse of a civilian business sector that has spent years creaking under the weight of the war, and a drift into stagnation that is damaging Russian civilians right now and will destroy their way of life in the future. Let's start with Russia's oil problem. After all, Ukraine has played a huge role in leading Russia down the rabbit hole of economic oblivion. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he believed that the country would pose absolutely no threat to Russia. Even if it could defend itself, which it soon showed that it could, Ukraine didn't have the sorts of long-range weapons that it would need to hurt Russia inside the motherland. And for a few years, Putin was right. Outside of occasional strikes using Western-made long-range weapons, the majority of the fighting was limited to Ukraine. Russia was getting off lightly because Ukraine didn't have what it needed to maintain a sustained, long-range campaign against the critical oil industry that pumps money into the Russian economy. Oh, how times have changed. It's 2026 now, and we're over 4 years deep into this special military operation that was supposed to last for a few days. Ukraine has evolved to become one of the strongest military nations in Europe, and it's spent the last 4 years developing new and stronger drones that can strike thousands of kilometers deep into Russia. As has so often been the case during his invasion, Putin drastically underestimated Ukraine's capabilities. Now, Russia is paying the price as Ukraine conducts a campaign to cut off the economic lifeblood that has allowed Russia to sustain Putin's war for so long. In a June 1st report, United 24 Media revealed that Ukraine's military has successfully targeted 15 Russian oil refineries since the beginning of 2026, with many of those refineries being victims of multiple strikes by the long-range weapons that Putin never thought Ukraine would develop. Through these strikes, Ukraine has effectively neutralized almost 40% of Russia's entire refining capacity as of the end of May. That's important. Through refining, Russia turns crude oil into dozens of usable products, with the most important being gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel that its military uses and that commands a premium when sold to other countries. These refinery strikes are being accompanied by repeated attacks against Russian oil terminals and storage facilities, meaning Ukraine strikes both the source of Russia's economic lifeblood and at the maritime arteries that enable the country to export its liquid gold so that billions of dollars can flood into Putin's war chest. The logic here is clear. Take away the oil, and you take away the money. And if the money disappears, Russia has to keep plunging itself deeper into debt to sustain Putin's insane defense spending. That's what we're seeing now. Domestically, these strikes create plenty of economic problems. Refineries are expensive to run. They require multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment, which is what Ukraine is targeting. Every repair that Russia has to make doubles the pain. Money is spent making the repairs, and it's lost for every day that the equipment is out of commission and unable to complete its role in the refining process. Shortages of fuel abound in Russia. Strict controls are being imposed on the sale of gasoline and diesel, which RBC Ukraine says extend all the way to New Moscow. In occupied Crimea, citizens are already being limited to buying just 20 litres of fuel per person. The knock-on effects of all this on Russian businesses can't be underestimated. Gas stations are making less money. Any industry that relies on fuel to function, from transport to civilian industry, is forced to cut back operations until the situation improves. Even something as simple as civilians not being able to travel for work all impacts the Russian economy. The result of all of this is that Russia's civilian businesses are struggling. But that's a problem that we'll dig deeper into later. Sticking with Russian oil and the country's energy market at large, the fuel restrictions don't just impact the country domestically. Exports are already being affected. Russia has banned the export of aviation fuel until November 30th, which is a direct result of Ukraine's refinery and energy infrastructure attacks. We're seeing something similar happen with gasoline. On April 2nd, Interfax reported that the Kremlin had extended a ban on gasoline exports to include the producers of the fuel, along with the pre-existing ban on exports by non-producers. That restriction will last until the end of July, but the odds are high that it will run longer if Ukraine maintains the tempo of its energy strikes. Spoiler alert, Ukraine will maintain the tempo. The inability to export fuel is crippling for Russia, especially as Operation Epic Fury has resulted in the prices of oil and the products made using oil rising. This should be a time for Russia to make hay while the sun shines, but as Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak reveals, that simply isn't happening. It's clear that there is a shortage of petroleum products on the global market today. Prices have risen significantly higher than oil prices. Everyone usually looks at oil prices, but prices for petroleum products are breaking all records. We see that refining is declining owing to the lack of oil. Many countries that rely on oil supplies and refine domestically have banned exports, including China, Novak said in the wake of Russia's gasoline export ban being announced. Novak is making excuses here. And you could also interpret this as a veiled message from another of Russia's officials to Putin that the Ukraine war needs to end. After all, Russia will be able to rake in billions if so much of its fuel wasn't being dedicated to the Ukraine invasion, but it can't. The war has to go on, as Putin has caught himself in a trap. So Russia gets export restrictions, loses billions of dollars, and plunges deeper into the economic chasm from which it can't escape. We're already seeing the shift in terms of what Russia can and can't do with its oil products. Exports are out, and they'll likely remain that way for as long as Ukraine's drones fly. Naturally, there's a major financial impact to all of this. But before we dig deeper into that, this is The Military Show, and there's a lot more where this comes from. If you're getting value from the channel, make sure you hit subscribe so you can see more of our analysis. In a May 13th report, Reuters revealed that Russian oil outputs were down 460,000 barrels per day in April, when compared to the same month in 2025. That's the last thing that Putin wanted to see, in a month where Russia would still have been able to take advantage of oil prices hovering around the $100 per barrel mark due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Still, the strait closure at least allowed Russia to make more money from its oil than it otherwise would. Far more worrying for Putin is what was happening before a one-off event came to Russia's rescue. In February, Investing.com revealed that the oil tax-related income that the Kremlin drew from oil sales had dropped by 50% in January 2026 when compared to the same month in 2025. A similar drop-off has been seen in the combined oil and gas sectors. At the same time, Russian Urals crude was trading at about $26 per barrel. The number is higher now, however, Russia is in a position where it's relying on external factors to prop up its oil sales. Once Operation Epic Fury ends and the Strait of Hormuz fully reopens, Russia will be right back to where it was at the beginning of the year, assuming that oil prices normalize. Now throw Ukraine's refinery, depot and terminal attacks into the equation. Those are problems that will exist and grow worse for as long as Putin continues his war. The Operation Epic Fury band-aid will peel off, and what will be left is the gaping energy sector wound that Ukraine has opened up. Russia's economy can't recover if it's relying on events elsewhere for the occasional windfall, which is already limited by the Kremlin's export restrictions. As for Ukraine, it isn't slowing down on the strike front. If anything, the already impressive results it's achieved during the first few months of 2026 are only going to be built upon. Records are being broken. Do you remember when we told you that Ukraine had hit 15 of Russia's refineries in 2026? Extend that timeline to the entire war and the number rises to 24 of Russia's 33 largest refineries, Euromaidan press reports. Right now, the outlet says, the only Russian refineries that are outside of Ukraine's strike range are in Omsk and Angarsk. And if Ukraine has shown us anything these past 4 years, it's that it will constantly build on its drone technologies to the point where those refineries, which are east of the Urals, will come into range. As for records, May was a major month for Ukraine's oil strikes. On June 1st, the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces of Ukraine, Robert Brovdy, revealed that Ukraine had hit more than 18 oil and gas infrastructure targets in May. That's a record-breaking number, and according to Brovdy, more than half of the targets that Ukraine struck have been forced to suspend or outright cease their operations. Again, this is all money that is being lost to repairs and the inability to extract, refine and sell oil products. Bit by bit, Ukraine is costing Russia billions. And at a time when the Russian state deficit is ballooning, the country's national wealth fund is being depleted amidst massive military spending. These are losses that Putin can't afford, but he keeps on spending anyway. With his fingers plugged firmly into his ears, he ignores the ringing alarm bells and calls on Russia's economists to find solutions to the country's financial woes that simply don't exist. Each time one of Ukraine's flying sanctions strikes, Russia's lifeblood is drained. Speaking of sanctions, that brings us to another of the major issues that have helped to lead Russia into its current situation. They took their time, but sanctions are now starting to cause severe problems for Russia. That's according to David O'Sullivan, who is an Irish official. He spoke to The Guardian in February, where he declared that Western sanctions are far from a silver bullet, but they are finally starting to have the sort of impact on Russia's economy that they need to have to make it even harder for Putin to escape from the trap that he's created for himself. I am fairly bullish. I think that the sanctions have really had a significant impact on the Russian economy, O'Sullivan told The Guardian, adding, "We may be, in the course of 2026, coming to a point where the whole thing becomes unsustainable, because so much of the Russian economy has been distorted so much by the building up of the war economy at the expense of the civil economy. I think defying the laws of economic gravity can only go on for so long." Indeed, the Western sanctions are far-reaching and have been implemented at a scale that Russia has never seen before. At the time of O'Sullivan's comments, the European Union alone had implemented 19 rounds of sanctions, impacting more than 2,700 individuals and entities across almost every economic area of Russia. The number of rounds is now up to 20. Castellum says that Russia is creaking under the weight of 26,655 sanctions, 23,960 of which have been implemented since Putin launched the full-scale invasion. The US is the heaviest hitter when it comes to the sheer number of sanctions it has in place, with 7,392. However, Canada, Switzerland, the EU, France, the UK and Australia have all implemented sanctions in the thousands, all of which make it harder for Russian businesses to operate. Here's why sanctions matter. Let's use the Russian oil refineries as an example once more. When Ukraine hits one of those refineries with its flying sanctions, whatever Ukraine hits needs to be repaired. That's the problem for Russia. Much of the machinery that keeps its refineries running requires components that need to be purchased from the countries that have sanctions in place. Now Russia can skirt these sanctions, been doing that since the beginning of the war, as we see with the shadow fleet that keeps the oil money flowing. In the case of acquiring Western components, Russia can have third countries purchase those components first, after which it buys them indirectly, but that's far more troublesome than simply buying directly. Russia has to wait longer to get the components it needs. It also has to pay what we could call a finder's fee on top of the cost of these components to incentivize third countries to help Russia skirt sanctions. Refineries stay offline longer, and Russia spends even more money. This is a microcosm of an issue that affects all Russian companies that the West has sanctioned. And over the long haul, the problem costs Russia billions of dollars, the effects of which are now finally starting to be felt. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, agrees with O'Sullivan that the sanctions problem is finally catching up to Putin. Yes, the sanctions having a biting effect on the Russian economy, Euronews reported von der Leyen stating on May 8th. She adds, "The consequences of Russia's war of choice are being paid for out of people's pockets. Keep those people in mind, we'll be coming back to them." Combine Ukraine's energy infrastructure strikes with sanctions and you get a nightmare scenario for Putin. And again, he's stuck in the trap. Sanctions aren't going away anytime soon. The only prospect of that happening is if the war ends, and Putin isn't going to pull the plug on that. So there will be more sanctions, more pressure, and as Putin continues to funnel money into Russia's defense industry, the third of our major causes of Russia's economic woes will go from rearing its head to sounding yet more alarms. Russia's civilian business sector is being crippled. In a May 30th report, the Kyiv Post said that Russia's domestic market has been fractured into what it calls a dual economy. On one side, you have the overheated military-industrial complex into which Russia has funneled billions of dollars and enormous amounts of its workforce. On the other side, there are civilian sectors. Right now, they're dealing with labor shortages, sky-high costs of doing business, and major capital issues, both in terms of the increased taxes they're being forced to pay and the difficulties they face in getting access to the cash they need to operate. The stats bear all of this out. The Kyiv Post reports that the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting has revealed that the past 3 months have seen toxic and non-performing assets within the Russian banking sector exceed the internationally recognized crisis threshold of 10%. That organization is pro-Kremlin, by the way, so this amounts to even more insiders trying to get Putin to wake up to the problems that he's created. Non-military companies inside Russia reported losses of 7.5 trillion rubles, or about $103 billion, between January and November 2025. Those losses were spread across 18,200 companies, which is the highest number of Russian businesses that have reported making losses since the pandemic. The manufacturing, mining, and wholesale sectors were the worst affected, and these losses are even higher than the projected state budget deficit that Russia currently has. It's an equation that doesn't add up. Russia's businesses are losing money. That means there's less revenue for the Kremlin to tax, which feeds into the budgetary problems that are only being made worse by Putin's stubborn refusal to see any solution to the crisis that he's created that doesn't involve the continuation of the war. The decline among Russian civilian sector businesses has continued into 2026. In a May 19th report, IntelliNews revealed that 68.7% of Russia's micro, small, and medium-sized businesses reported that their revenues had declined in early 2026. About 31% of Russia's small business owners considered shutting up shop during the first quarter of the year, which is the highest percentage seen since Putin invaded Ukraine. All of those businesses are dealing with a 2% increase in value-added tax, along with the 14.5% interest rates and high levels of inflation that we mentioned earlier. Returning to banking, there were 60 banks in Russia making losses in March 2026, which is about 20% of Russia's entire banking sector. And again, this is the worst figure in Russia since 2022. What Putin has created here is a compounding issue. The more he pumps into a military-industrial sector that is already starting to stagnate, the more he takes away from Russia's civilian enterprise. Is any entrepreneur going to want to start a business in these kinds of conditions, where they have to pay more in taxes and interests on loans than ever before? Unlikely. The businesses that already exist are dealing with labor being swallowed up by Russia's defense industry, along with all of the economic problems that exist in Russia. Ultimately, these businesses become less productive. Most that export products or services generate less revenue than they have in the past, which only makes the problem worse for Putin. He's already watching Russia's energy sector take a beating. When civilian businesses are struggling as they are, they're in no position to pick up the slack. They're being strangled too, and the impact is clear for everybody to see. In a May 9th report, Forbes revealed that a quarter of Russia's bond market is now at risk of default, as a slew of businesses that borrowed money at low rates before the war now face refinancing at much higher rates. The non-payment of commercial bills in Russia had already hit $109 billion in January, the outlet reports. There's a house of cards here, and it's on the verge of falling. When bills aren't being paid, banks struggle. If the banks collapse, Russia loses the financial institutions that are trying to hold everything together, which will be yet another catastrophe for a country that is already in the economic doldrums. And then there are the Russian people. Ultimately, all of this economic pain that Putin has created by guiding himself into the trap that is his special military operation is being absorbed by everyday Russians. The spectre of recession looms large in Russia as Putin kills his country's civilian sector to keep his war going. Stagnation has already arrived. Russia's GDP grew by just 1% in 2025, and the forecasts for 2026 that we've already shared are even lower. According to the New Voice of Ukraine, the composite leading indicator that signals the Russian economy's entry into recession has been above 0.44 since November 2025. The critical threshold is 0.12. Recession is coming, and there's no rapid recovery in sight. Every factor that we've discussed in this video highlights how Putin's war has come home. The Russian people are bearing the brunt of all of this, with the Telegraph reporting that opposition momentum is building as the economic pain caused by Putin's war becomes unbearable. Putin's response has been typical. As he faces backlash from his people, the Kremlin has cracked down on internet access and blocked the use of apps like Telegram, all in a desperate effort to keep the discontent under control. Trust in Putin is at an all-time low. Kremlin-linked pollster VTS-IOM says that trust reached a wartime low of 71% in April, and the Levada Center said in March that 67% of Russians now want Putin to move toward peace negotiations. But Putin doesn't listen. He never does. Instead, he tries to create the illusion that he isn't caught in a trap. At the time of creating this video, Putin is hosting the 5th St. Petersburg International Economic Forum since the invasion. Derided by Reuters as the Russian Davos, that conference is supposed to produce new relationships and ideas for boosting Russia's economy, but it won't. There's nothing that can be done as long as Putin continues his war, as all he'll keep doing is plowing money into the Russian defense sector. Ukraine's drones will continue to fly. More sanctions will come. Russia's civilian business sector and its civilians will continue their collapse. And there will be Putin, stuck in his hole, pretending that none of this is his fault. And as the crisis explodes in Russia, Ukraine just keeps plugging along with devastating long-range strikes that can only make the pain worse. In recent devastating strikes, Ukraine took out a Russian frigate and missile corvette to weaken Putin's Black Sea posture. That's more money that Russia needs to spend on military equipment, and you can find out all about these strikes and what they mean for Russia by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this analysis of the crippling situation that Putin has created for his country, then hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this comes from on The Military Show. And thank you as always for watching.